Welcome to Next Anatomy. In this session, we'll be talking about the inferior surface, that's the base of brain, their sulci and gyri. In the inferior surface of the cerebral hemisphere, we divided into a smaller orbital part and a larger tentorial part. Now, this will be our smaller orbital part on either side and the larger tentorial part. In the middle, you could able to identify midbrain, pons, medulla. On either side, you could able to identify the attachment of the cerebellar hemispheres too. Now, when you see the orbital part, especially, we could able to identify an olfactory sulcus which runs on the medial border, and the largest olfactory bulb and olfactory tract. And also, we do identify a separate sulcus which divides into anterior, posterior, medial, lateral, orbital sulci. So if we could able to identify in this photograph, we could able to see the optic chiasm, the midbrain, and the following parts of the attachments. So now this is our smaller orbital part. So now here we could able to identify the middlemost level, gyri rectus, which is separated from the orbital gyrus. At this level, we will be having a sulcus. The name of the sulcus is called as an olfactory sulcus. Towards medially, we have gyri rectus. On the olfactory sulcus, you will be having olfactory bulb, which is leading into olfactory tract. Then we have a letter H-shaped sulcus called as H-shaped orbital sulci, which differentiates them into anterior, posterior, medial, lateral, orbital gyrus. And the orbital part and the tentorial part were being separated by the lateral stem of the lateral sulcus. And then we do identify the larger tentorial part. The most medially we identify the uncus and separated by a sulcus called as a rhinal sulcus towards to the medial occipitotemporal gyrus. Uncus itself will continues descends downwards as the parahippocampal gyrus, and we have been separated by an important sulcus called as collateral sulcus. Means uncus parallelly you have rhinal sulcus, below it will continues as collateral sulcus. And in the middle, beneath the parahippocampal gyrus, from the medial surface, I was been intersected by the calcarean sulcus too. And at the lower down, you are being intersected by posterior calcarean sulcus. In between, you have another gyrus called as lingual gyrus. And the lunate sulcus will differentiate as previously in the supralateral surface also we started to differentiate the occipital pole. Once we have done the middlemost portion, that's uncus, parahippocampal gyrus and lingual gyrus, which are separated by rhinal and the collateral sulcus. Then we had another very important sulcus, so that is called as the occipitotemporal sulcus, which differentiates into the medial occipitotemporal gyrus and the lateral occipitotemporal gyrus. This all speaks about the inferior surface of the cerebral hemisphere, and they do have their own functional areas of their olfactory pathway and other different functional areas. And this is one more pictorial remembrance of the orbital part and the tentorial part. And when we move to the blood supply to the inferior surface, the orbital part will be supplied by anterior cerebral artery and also the middle cerebral artery. The anterior cerebral artery will give off a branch called the orbitofrontal artery. Especially this applies to the medial orbital gyrus and also the most medialmost gyri rectus. So now this is our gyri rectus, and at this level we have H-shaped sulci. So the medial most area, so this area will be supplied by the anterior cerebral artery. And the middle cerebral artery will give of orbital branches. This applies to the lateral orbital gyrus. So now this will be our lateral orbital gyrus, which will be branching from the middle cerebral artery. Then moving on to the tentorial portion, we have blood supply coming from the posterior cerebral artery and also from the middle cerebral artery. Already the middle cerebral artery is supplying to the lateral orbital gyrus. Same likewise here also it gives off branches to the inferior temporal lobe. And also the posterior cerebral artery is the main source of the blood supply to the tentorial part of the temporal lobe and the occipital lobe. And they supplies mainly to the parahippocampal gyrus and the lower down calcarean portion occipitotemporal artery supplies to the occipital lobe. Here we do identify the middlemost portion will be supplied by the posterior cerebral artery branches. You could able to identify the branching patterns. So the anterior temporal branch, posterior temporal branch, all this whole area will be taken out by the posterior cerebral artery. Also, the use of anterior choroidal arteries applies to the deeper structures to even uncus and amygdaloid body. Generally, while we see the inferior surface, we do identify the mid portion of the midbrain, then followed by the midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. For this, we will separately study about the circle of Willis. So that's why given a one word that we do identify brainstem cerebellum, which they gets blood supply by right and left vertebral arteries joins together to form the basilar artery. And detailed part of the circle of Willis will be discussed in the another session. Stay tuned to next anatomy.